Just imagine this for a second. You're trapped deep beneath the ocean, in a steel tube. The air is thick, the temperature is soaring past 140 degrees, and you have no idea what's happening in the world above. You think, you believe, a world-ending war has just started. And those words you just heard? We will die, but we will sink them all. That's your captain speaking. You've got the power to launch a nuclear torpedo in your hands. So, what do?
Now, this isn't some made-up Hollywood movie plot. This is the almost unbelievable true story of what was probably the single most dangerous moment in all of human history, and the story of a man you've likely never heard of, who single-handedly prevented Armageddon. So how on earth did one man end up with the fate of the entire world resting on his shoulders?
Well, to really get how we ended up in that submarine, we have to zoom out and look at the global chessboard. This wasn't just about two superpowers not liking each other. Note, this was a deadly serious game of strategy, of positioning, and it was all being driven by technology, and frankly, a whole lot of fear.
And you know, this whole thing, this whole terrifying chain reaction really kicked off with one single event. Back in 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik. Now, that wasn't just some cool science fair project. Oh no. To the US, it was terrifying proof that if the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could build an ICBM to hit America. The response was fast, and by 1959, the US had placed its own pieces on the board.
And boy, were they powerful pieces. From these new American bases in Turkey, a nuclear missile could hit Moscow, get this, in just 16 minutes. Think about that. That put the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev at a huge disadvantage. The board was completely tilted in America's favor, and he needed to make a countermove, and he needed to do it fast.
And that countermove, it came from a place nobody was really expecting. A tiny island in the Caribbean that had just gone through a massive political revolution, putting it smack dab in the center of this global power struggle.
You see, when Fidel Castro took over and created a socialist state just 90 miles from Florida, the U.S., understandably, saw it as a massive threat. Their first move was to try and overthrow him with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was, to put it mildly, a total and complete disaster. It failed spectacularly, and all it did was push a very nervous Castro right into the waiting arms of the Soviet Union. And just like that, Khrushchev had his perfect opportunity.
And he did not let it go to waste. In total secrecy, disguised as regular cargo, Khrushchev's plan went into motion. He snuck 42 nuclear missiles onto the island of Cuba. And just like that, the strategic balance was completely upended. Now, the Soviets had their own dagger pointed right at the heart of America. Then, on October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flies over Cuba and takes pictures of the missile sites. The secret was out. And what came next were 13 days where the entire world just held its breath, staring straight into the abyss of total nuclear war.
President Kennedy's first move was incredibly smart, very calculated. He didn't use the word blockade, right? Because a blockade, legally speaking, is an act of war. Instead, he called it a quarantine. It was this brilliant little bit of diplomatic language designed to stop things from immediately blowing up, while still showing the Soviets that America meant business.
But don't let the careful language fool you. Behind the scenes, things were about as serious as they could possibly get. The U.S. military raised its alert level to DEFCON 2. Let that sink in. This was the first and so far the only time in history that has ever happened.
And let's be absolutely clear about what DEFCON 2 means. It is the very last step right before all-out nuclear war. We're talking about a fleet of B-52 bombers, each one carrying enough nuclear weapons to wipe out multiple cities, airborne, in the sky, 24/7, just waiting for the order to go. The entire world was on a hair trigger. So you have this incredibly tense situation on the surface, right? Leaders are negotiating, armies are mobilizing, but the real flashpoint, the single most critical moment of this entire crisis, happened completely out of sight, in the crushing blackness of the deep ocean. A Soviet submarine, the B-59, was hiding near the quarantine line, and let me tell you, the conditions inside were just hell on earth. It was over 140 degrees, CO2 levels were becoming toxic, and worst of all, they'd been cut off from Moscow for days. They were totally blind, with no way of knowing if World War III had already started up above. And then, the U.S. Navy found them. American destroyers started dropping these small practice depth charges, not to sink them, but to try and force them to the surface. But to the crew inside who already thought war was raging, these explosions felt like a real attack.
The constant, deafening ping, ping, ping of sonar from every direction was, as one officer put it, pure torture.
Now, here's the detail the Americans had no idea about. The B-59 wasn't just any sub. It was carrying a special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, with the same destructive force as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But there was a protocol. To launch it, you needed the unanimous agreement of 3 senior officers on board: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander, a man named Vasily Arkhipov.
So, in the middle of all this chaos and noise, completely convinced they were under attack and about to die, Captain Savitsky just lost it. He screamed, "We will sink them all!" He gave his approval to fire. The political officer agreed. 2 of the 3 keys were turned. The fate of the world literally came down to one man's decision.
So, what was it? In that moment of absolute stress, panic, and confusion, with everything on the line, what on earth could possibly make one man say no?
Well, the answer wasn't in his military training. It was in his memory. You see, just 1 year earlier, Vasily Arkhipov was an officer on the K-19 submarine when its nuclear reactor had a catastrophic meltdown. He had personally watched his crewmates, his friends, die these slow, horrifying deaths from acute radiation poisoning. He knew, up close and personal, in the most gruesome detail imaginable, what nuclear power unleashed can do to a human being.
And so, Arkhipov argued against launching. He reasoned that these couldn't be real attacks. They had to be signals to get them to surface. He made an impossible choice: to trust an enemy he couldn't see, over the panicked but seemingly logical conclusion of his own captain. It was a decision rooted not in military doctrine, but in his own humanity.
I mean, it really came down to these 2 paths. The logical choice, based on every single piece of information they had in that moment, was to fire that torpedo. It was their duty. But the human choice, a choice informed by past trauma and just a tiny sliver of hope, was to wait. Arkhipov stood his ground, refused to give his consent, and somehow convinced the captain to surface the submarine.
But you know, here's the really crazy part of this story. The people who pulled us back from the brink, they weren't treated like heroes. Not at all. Kennedy was called weak by his own generals for making a deal. Khrushchev was kicked out of power a couple of years later, partly because of his humiliating retreat. And Arkhipov? A superior officer told him to his face, "It would have been better if you had gone down with your ship."
This whole crisis really hammered home the terrifying logic of the Cold War, this idea of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. It's the idea that nobody would be crazy enough to start a nuclear war because everybody would lose, right? But what this story really shows us is just how fragile that stable system was. It was almost completely shattered by bad luck, by miscommunication, and by the insane pressure put on just a few individual human beings.
And don't just take my word for it. Other Soviet submarine commanders later admitted it. From a purely military point of view, the logical, by-the-book thing to do in that submarine was to launch that torpedo. The decision that saved every single one of us was, by all military accounts, the illogical one.
And that really brings us to a final, pretty critical question for our own time. The world was saved by a decision that wasn't based on data or probability, but on trauma, on empathy, and a deep, painful understanding of human suffering, qualities that a purely logical system or an AI might not have. So, as we build a world that relies more and more on pure logic, it's worth asking ourselves, what happens when we lose that illogical, unpredictable, and ultimately life-saving human element?